By Malin Björk, a Swedish MEP with the European United Left. We're also joined by Italian MEP Ellie Schlein, you're with the Socialists and Democrats, and French MEP Dominique Riquet with the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats. But Ms. Björk, you visited, I know, the Calais camp. These people, how do you feel it, you know, looking from outside, from Sweden? How do you see both the French and the British reactions? You know, a lot of these minors have the legal right under international law to give an asylum.
Yes, and there are clearly also minors and others that have the right to come to the UK, and others would have to stay in France. But what strikes me, and I've been there twice, is that this situation is not worthy of 2016 in Europe. It's a camp where the situation is quite awful, and there are, like the reportage said, there are about 1,000 minors. I mean, it's not safe for children and women in that camp, and we have to instead of investing in walls, which is being done now at this very moment, we have to invest in reception and integration. It's so easy. If there is the political will, it's so easy.
And of course, the new political will from the EU seems to be investing in these centres outside of the EU. I know, Ms. Schlein, Italy now on the front line of the new arrivals, really. Mostly these new arrivals coming from Libya, from African countries. And the plan is really to keep them in African countries.
Yeah, there is a tendency, unfortunately, in the European policies to kind of externalize progressively our borders and responsibility, and I think it's a huge mistake. By the way, I was in New York a couple of weeks ago for the first summit on refugees and migrants, and I heard them talking about global efforts. How can we be credible in asking for global efforts when within Europe we are not showing solidarity and an equal share of responsibility, which, by the way, is already written in our treaties at Article 78 and 80, so it doesn't make sense at all.
Indeed, I believe Italy's Prime Minister is now saying that the EU should put sanctions on notably Eastern countries that were refusing to take part in that refugee relocation system. Mr. Riquet, do you think perhaps that is the solution? You know, so far there's been absolutely no consequence for EU countries that don't want anything to do with it.
But as you know, it's very difficult to take sanction against a country for everything, yes. If you are looking, for example, with the budget and the Stability Pact is the same one. We are always saying that we have to take a sanction, but we didn't at all. And so I think it's the same for the migrant crisis.
Ms. Björk, this is a large failing then on the part of the EU, is it not?
Well, yes, and I think you know, we have to at some point sit down and say, what kind of continent are we building here? What is, you know, a continent of over 500 million? Of course, we can take a bigger responsibility in a global, very difficult situation, which means that has some consequences. We have to form a coalition of the willing countries, and I'm saying that's maybe 24 out of the 27 or 28. That is not bad. So let's go that route instead. Let's not adapt to the least common denominator if that country is Hungary. You know, so let's be a little bit creative, and let's be political, and let's show solidarity. That's
without consequences for those who don't want? Yeah, move on.
Of course, yeah, move on. And of course that can have, in terms of EU funding, have some consequences. But first, the coalition of the willing, and let's see how we can move forward.
Of course, as we were saying, a lot of people arriving into Italy from Libya. Now, the EU can't do a similar Turkey-EU deal with Libya, given the state of the country at the moment. It is looking, though, at partnership agreements with a number of African countries. Apparently, there's been testing these type of agreements with 5, with Mali, Nigeria, Niger, Senegal and Ethiopia. Can you tell us a bit more about what exactly we're trying to set up there and how it's working?
Well, actually, I can challenge anyone to tell me that Niger, Nigeria are safe countries in this situation. I was in many detention centers for migrants in Italy, and I met a lot of women who were victims of sexual violence, exploitation of any kind. So these people are automatically sent back. The main idea of the new partnership framework is to make development aid conditional to cooperation and in the field of migration. That also means border management. But let me remind that the aim of the development aid is only one: to eradicate poverty, to fight inequalities. And I think that walls and building walls in other African countries is not actually decreasing inequality, but it's going to increase the problem. So if you just move the problems, you're not solving it. That's the point.
Mr. Riquet, do you not agree? And that is the solution across Europe. It's nearly to keep it out beyond our vision, and then we feel like problem solved, when really it's not at all.
Yes, I agree. But I think it's very difficult because it's not the same concern between the different member states. Because in some member states, for example, in Sweden, is not the same that in Hungary, for example, and the external policy, for example, is not the same at all. And we have not external policy in EU because the treaty don't give us at all something about that. So I think it's very difficult because we have not European team in front of this problem.
But is that the solution, to try and set up these countries, basically pay these countries to try and keep people outside of the EU? Is that the idea, funding programs in these countries? Or is it more creating more hotspots and trying...
No, I think that what Ellie said here earlier, that we are trying, the EU, yes, there's no foreign policy in some senses, but in others, yes. Now they are agreeing to put this ring around Europe to stop people from coming. I think that is unacceptable in a global situation where Europe needs to decide that we take a bigger responsibility, not push it over on already strained countries in Africa, for example.
There's also the question of readmission. I mean, a lot of the migrants coming into Italy now are being told they're economic migrants, they're not exactly refugees. And there is the question of readmission. 40%, I believe, of failed asylum seekers in Europe get returned. That's according to the EU Commission. This is something that we're also trying to increase. Apparently, talks going on with Nigeria.
Well, not only. In the month of August, we'd announced the forced return of 48 Sudanese people to Sudan, which is a country in which no human rights are respected nowadays, and especially for people who are fleeing, and they're fleeing for some reasons. So yes, it's happening a lot. And let me give you a couple of numbers. 86% of all displaced persons are in developing countries. That's why the UN called a summit to ask for a global effort. And what is Europe doing? Here we are in a situation in which for years, 6 member states of 28 have dealt alone with 80% of all asylum requests. What are we even talking about? When Canada is showing the will to resettle, even if the system is not perfect because very selective, but 35,000 people in 4 months, in the same months, the European Union could not, and the European government could not respect their promise on relocation and resettlements within Europe.
I believe Sweden's Minister for Justice and Migration at one point said that, the Europe could actually welcome up to 1 million new people into the Union every year if dealt with properly. Do you still think that's the case? Even though Sweden has been one of the most open doors countries, it's now changing though.
It has changed, and my party is very critical of that, because I don't think it's by closing your own borders that you will make others open theirs. So I think we should have done it differently, and I think Sweden will have an important and should play a bigger role now in saying we are opening borders again, and let's sit down here and see how we can take this bigger responsibility.
But the idea currently from Sweden is to try and send people back, and insisting, it will take Hungary to court unless it takes people back. Surely that's not.
I think it's the wrong way to go, and I think they will be proven wrong in that.
Mr. Riquet, how do you see the solution to that? And do you think economically and viably the EU can absorb up to 1 million people every year?
I think at first it's not a problem of money, it's a problem of civilization. I think you have a great fear on the people, for example, and not for a lot of people in Europe it's unacceptable to have a huge amount of refugee, and I think it's a political problem for the government. And if you are losing your election, you are losing your position, you lose all what's possible for the acceptation of migration and for the asylum policy. For example, in Hungary, they have not problem of unemployment, the need for workers.
Yeah.
They have
so it's not exactly a logical...
quasi absolutely no migrant at home, and all the people say we don't want it all for migrants.
Or even in France, that anger, if you like, is growing. I believe there's one town, the National Front is going to hold a referendum on that refugee question. Acceptable? How should the French government reply to that?
No, it's unacceptable, I think.
So it should be forbidden, it should be...
Yeah. But you have the populism, yes. It's a problem, because if the populism when the election it will be worse.
Okay, well, I think that's going to be a whole other debate for us, is how to address that question of rising populism across the EU. But thanks indeed for your insights on the latest news coming out with this migration crisis, a topic that will undoubtedly come up again in the next few weeks and months. Thanks also to you at home for having joined. That brings us to the end of this half of Talking Europe.